Welcome to everybody and happy Wednesday morning to you and a belated Happy New Year. We've done one call this year so far, but I wish Happy New Year again. And we've got lots to discuss, so I'm going to get right into it. The United States of America and the great state of Texas are not short on topics to discuss during this period of history. We'll look back on this 20 or 30 years from now and say we've all lived through a very historical time, although not all of it's pleasant. So let's get right into it. First of all, for those of you all who have joined our conference calls in the past but have never listened into a podcast we started doing about 5 months ago, I would urge you to consider listening in to some of the podcasts we've done on a program called See the Future, my last name in the future. If you Google that, you'll pull it up very quickly on a bunch of podcast services, and we've had a bunch of really, really compelling guests, and the content is meant to be educational. And for those of you all who think I talk too much as it is, I basically ask questions and get out of the way and let the guests do all the discussing. So if you want to hear from artists and intellectuals and four-star generals and admirals and senators and philanthropists, it's a great chance to really expand your knowledge base and listen to people who are experts in their field. See the future. I'd encourage you to listen. I think we got around 35 or so podcasts up or about to be up, and there will be more to come. I'm going to start with the winter storm in Texas today. It was really intriguing to me that everything in our country and to a lesser degree the world is political these days. And when you have a human tragedy, a natural disaster that rivals everything but probably the Galveston hurricane of 1900, to see it immediately become political and everyone point fingers at everybody else, it was kind of astounding. We lost at least 30 lives in Texas. The economic damage is projected to be well over $100 billion, billion with a B. And yet you've watched what I would call green power, green technology, clean power people point their fingers at fossil fuels and say it's all the fault of fossil fuels and we need to get off fossil fuels and natural gas wasn't online. And then you've got fossil fuel advocates pointing the finger at green power advocates and saying wind turbines were frozen solid. And then you've got career politicians in the executive branch of state government and the federal government and the legislature pointing their fingers at ERCOT and FERC and the PUC and everything else. It's like there was a constant blame game. Ted Cruz became an object of derision and slings and arrows of outrageous fortune for mistiming his family trip to Mexico on the beach, and it just went on and on and on. And I think these circular firing squads in the face of tragedy are both comical and sad at the same time, because basically when you have a tragedy of this magnitude, you don't focus on who's to blame. There will be plenty of years to look back and talk about what went wrong, but what people should be focused on is solutions. And in a lot of tragedies of this magnitude, solutions are not readily apparent or obvious. This one it is. This is very fixable. It wasn't the fault of green power. It wasn't the fault of fossil fuels. It was the fault of a once in 100 years catastrophic winter event. We have been looking for years in Texas about summer heat and the demands on the power system for the summer, but we had not looked with sharpness towards what might happen in the winter. And we can change that in a heartbeat. A lot of people say we just don't have enough power. Well, that's not true. We have plenty of power on the base load power, which is predominantly fossil fuel and nuclear in nature, and in the add-ons, which is the wind turbines and the solar power and things of that sort. Will we need more power in the future? Most certainly so, especially in the base load, which is backstopped predominantly by fossil fuels, but we'll also need some more clean power as well as Texas moves to 50 or 60 million citizens in the future. But for now, this is eminently fixable. How do you fix it? Well, you winterize things. You winterize the wind turbines just like you do in the northern parts of the country. You winterize natural gas gathering and processing systems and wellheads. We've also heard talk about winterizing natural gas power plants. That's fine too, but if it's frozen up at the wellhead or in the gathering and processing systems, you can't get it to the power plant. So The imminent solution, and a solution that should take place, has to take place before next winter. Let's say the odds are 1 in 100 we have another 100-year storm next winter. Well, a 1% chance of a $130 billion catastrophe and dozens of lives lost is too high a percentage. We need that to be as close to zero next year as possible. And the way you do that is you winterize all this, and people are focused on being very efficient in Texas, what the cost of that will be. And that's important, and you want to do that as efficiently and as effectively as possible. But the cost of winterizing these systems compared to $130 billion, or whatever the number tends to be, economic tragedy is really minuscule. And whether we fix this purely on the private sector with mandates for power producers to winterize their systems, or whether it's a public-private partnership, or whether we tap the rainy day fund, if you've got a rainy day fund for disasters and you don't tap it for Hurricane Harvey, which we didn't a few years back immediately, or this, what's that fund for? Is it to sit in cash earning 0%, or is it to make Texans' lives superior as a function of public safety and the common good? Well, it's really clear what we do. And I would just say, for all the people running around pointing fingers at everybody else, and a lot of those are career politicians, there needs to be accountability by the people of Texas going into the next cycle. I don't think blaming anybody for this, which was not super foreseeable, it was somewhat foreseeable, but not so much, is a waste of time this time around. We just need to go fix this. But if we have a recurrence of this in the next 5 years, it's time to fire anybody who has political power or bureaucratic power who can oversee things like this. You've seen multiple resignations in the bureaucracy, which is, I guess, fine. I guess all well and good, probably deserved in some instances, maybe in all instances. But the buck stops with the political leadership at some point, because they oversee our state. And this needs to be fixed within the year, or we need to fire a whole bunch of career politicians who are busy pointing fingers at other people. So that would be my glimmer of hope in a very sad situation, that this is imminently fixable. And we need to hold our elected officials and our bureaucrats accountable to have a fix for this in place within the year, so we can look Texans in the eye and our fellow citizens and say never again on something like this. Secondly, I want to move to the pandemic. With all the doom and gloom and the continued calls to stay in the bunker at a multi-generational tragic event in U.S. life, the death rate exceeds World War II, I believe World War II and World War I combined at this point, and rivals the Spanish influence of 1918 as well. Here's the good news, which you're not reading in the press and you're not hearing from the current administration, and the overabundance of caution has kind of stultified the good news, which is cases of COVID-19 have plummeted in the last month. We are now about 70% below the daily run rate that we were experiencing just a month and a half ago. We are well on our way to vaccination of our populace and herd immunity. And there was an excellent editorial in the Wall Street Journal about 2 or 3 weeks ago, which I commend to your reading, from a professor and academic and expert in the field at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, which many of you are familiar as one of the top 3 hospitals and research institutions in the country, maybe number 1. And he wrote an editorial in the Journal basically predicting herd immunity by April 1st. He may be a little early on that, but he's not too far off. You take the number of cases and you multiply that by the number of cases undetected, which is presumed to be between a factor of 3 and 6x what the reported cases are. And you look at the 2 million plus vaccinations a day that are now available. It doesn't take an active imagination to see over 70% of our country's populace either vaccinated or already having received the virus and gotten over it, and we can move on to regular life again. So all these caustic comments at Texas, at South Dakota, at North Dakota, at other states that are fully opening up again are completely misplaced. You can maybe parcel Governor Abbott's decision, which was initiated on Texas Independence Day, March 2nd, which is obviously a political statement, that he might have been a little early in removing the mask mandate, but he wasn't that early. Maybe a month early, maybe 6 weeks. We can quibble over that. But the reality is most people in the state have carried on life as normal and they continue to wear masks, and many private businesses and even public institutions continue to mandate a mask when you get into settings that are more conducive to the spread of COVID-19. And we are in a great position for our state and our country to open up dramatically in the next several months. And what comes with that? Well, I'd like to turn from that good news to other good news, which is the economy is about to explode. People were predicting a 4 to 5% growth rate for the economy this year. They're now increasing those rates to 6, 7, even 8% because there is so much pent-up economic activity that's going to come spiraling into day-to-day life, whether it's recreation or travel or restaurants or getting back to work in the office space, everything else. It's going to be really fun to watch. And after a very tragic year we've experienced in our country and around the world, it's going to be a real breath of fresh air for everybody. So that when you look at the economy and the growth we're going to see, I want to turn to the stimulus bill that is just passed or is about to pass the Congress and be signed by the president. It's fascinating to watch us spend $5 trillion on stimulus in the last 6 to 9 months. This is the latest $2 trillion. And about $400 billion of that $2 trillion is razor focused on the pandemic and the effects of that and allaying some of the damage from that and helping protect the most vulnerable in our society. The rest is classic pork barrel spending on pet causes and everything else. And you look at our national debt, which is $28 trillion today, and with this stimulus package, will probably in short order go to $30 trillion. You look at the long-term effects of that, and they really are frightening. I don't spook easily, but when I look at the growth in entitlements and the current level of the nominal federal debt and where we're headed, and it doesn't take an active imagination to get us into fiscal peril in our country in short order. Basically, interest rates on treasuries probably average around 1 to 1.5% if you go all across treasuries today. And at $30 trillion, that's about $300 to $450 billion in interest every year, which is the second largest line item in the federal budget behind the defense budget. It also, in a period of interest rate growth and inflation growth, doesn't take an active imagination over the next several years for that interest rate to go from 1 to 1.5 to 4. And at 4%, just the interest on the federal debt becomes the largest expenditure in federal spending, dwarfing the Department of Defense budget, which is around $800 billion, would be probably around 50% higher than that. And if you don't think eventually this and the growth in the entitlements leads us to a soft default on the debt, and what that means is the dollar loses value and people don't respect our currency as much, and it means our purchasing power of our money goes way down, which is what is known as a soft default. We don't pay back our obligations with the same value of dollars. We pay it back with much diminished values of dollars, or even a hard default someday where it's unthinkable, but where we don't meet our obligations for the first time in our country's history. It's a crisis. And at some point, the government's got to come to grips with it. And you're going to watch the Democratic administration of President Biden view the solution of this as higher taxes, that we're going to balance the budget through higher taxes, which obviously has a very frictional braking effect on economic growth and eventually slows us down to a malaise type of nominal or no growth whatsoever. But the reality is historically, when taxes have been raised, yes, federal revenue as a net does go up, but when has spending ever flatlined or gone down? It doesn't. So the likelihood that our annual deficits in our federal debt are going to plateau out or go down are little to none from this kind of policy. It's a great way to say you're going to get fiscally responsible and balance the budget, but it's also a great way to redistribute money from one unfavored class to another favored class, and will result in a whole lot of dislocation in the country. And the other thing that's amusing to me is to watch politicians act like that taxpayers who they can hit on for more and more payments of tax are static targets, that they're just going to sit there and take it. And anybody who has viewed economic behavior over the years knows that when you tax an entity or an individual or a group of people, that they're going to change their behavior to try to lessen the pain and diminish the tax. And so going forward, looking at that, you have to assess the fact that we're going to continue to run deficits. We're going to continue to jack up the debt, and there's got to be a reduction in spending, especially this pork barrel kind of spending, if we're going to get anywhere near to a balanced budget. And then beyond that, there has to be entitlement reform at some point, and no one has the courage or will to do that. And I've been throwing arrows at the left and at the Democrats, but I'll throw some arrows at the past administration too. Entitlements were untouchable during that administration. Nobody wants to make the hard choices. Everybody wants to feed at the trough or get a sugar high. And this is all going to come to roost someday, but that's a long-term problem. In the shorthand, because of valuations on stocks, there have been many, many calls in the investment community for a significant correction. We had an all-time record correction last February and March when the market dropped 37% in 1 month. It was catastrophic, but it quickly bounced back. And I'm going to go on record as saying we may have some corrections this year, but it's going to be really hard to derail the stock market at a 10-year Treasury yield of 1.5%. There really still is no alternative for equities. But for those of you all who are enamored with growth stocks, trading at anywhere from 30 to 100 times earnings or dozens of multiples of sales, it's going to be really hard for those stocks, no matter how fast they grow, to keep going up at a 50% annualized rate like they have in the past. What is you see a rotational shift from those kind of stocks into very underpriced value stocks domestically, small cap stocks, commodity stocks anticipating higher prices and inflation, and international stocks. And investors should really carefully survey those kind of possibilities for their portfolio so they've got a more balanced investment set up and they're not completely focused on growth and growth stocks. This is a trend that seems to have legs. It does not seem to be slowing down. It probably will go on for quite some time to come. And a rotation in the market is healthy. It's called reversion to the mean, where things that are overpriced become more fairly priced by stagnating or going down in value, and things that are underpriced reach a more fair valuation. So for the overall health of the stock market, for the 80% or so of the stock market that's lagged the 20% or so that's been driving the bus, this is a healthy phenomenon, and why I'm still constructive on stocks with no alternatives in fixed income and with a lot of economic growth to come. It's going to be very hard for bears or negative perspective from investors to take down the market this year. 2022 may be another story if our economic growth diminishes significantly with high tax increases and a hangover from the sugar high of stimulus and things of that sort. But this year should still be pretty healthy unless you own Zoom or Snowflake or some of these, or Bumble or some of these overpriced tech stocks that just are detached from reality. I want to shift to the other instances of bubble-like behavior in the market, whether it's private equity, where companies are being purchased at all-time historical highs of multiples of EBITDA earnings or sales, and also SPACs. You know, some of these newfangled ways to go public where you reverse merge with an existing public entity and cash out in a significant way while your speculative small company trades at valuations of an unlimited multiple to earnings because they don't have any earnings yet, or dozens of multiples of sales because the companies are early on in their economic life cycle or their growth. And I would just say, as much as there is a lot of speculation here, this is a great triumph of American ingenuity and our drive to constantly push the needle on technological advancement, societal advancement, and improvement in driven by capitalist fervor and the desire to grow and create new industries. And you look at whether it's 3D printing or software or the cloud or things of this sort, you've got some ingenuity and innovation that is just spectacular. And most of these companies are going to fail, but that's the price of capitalism. When you dare greatly and strive greatly and take great risks, not everybody crosses the finish line. But a lot of these companies are going to be the great companies of the future. And it's going to be really exciting to watch that, unless you speculate on the wrong companies and take a big hit on your balance sheet. So proceed with caution, those of you all who are investing in SPACs and things of that sort. I want to talk briefly about bonds. Unless you want to follow the parable of the talent with the gentleman in that parable who buried the one talent in the backyard, you're not going to get a whole lot out of bonds in the coming years. Bonds are down about 1 to 1.5% this year. The 10-year Treasury still yields an anemic 1.5%, and if interest rates go up, the value of the bonds held goes down. So the odds that in the next 5 years, a generic across-the-board bond portfolio is going to yield after inflation higher than zero is very, very low. There'll probably be a nominal return in the 1 to 3% range, but after inflation, most of that return gets eaten up. So people who are relying on bonds should be very cautious and have very short duration bonds and not speculate on long-term bonds. I would also say there's a fascinating thing going on right now in the push-pull between advocates of fossil fuels and advocates of clean energy and green energy. Ironically, commodity prices were kept super low during the Trump administration, which was a full-throated advocate of fossil fuels, because there was such an encouragement of increased supply that supply overwhelmed demand and drove prices down. And now that the Biden administration has come into play, which is very, very hostile to fossil fuels, you have new pipeline projects being rejected, so you can't move around oil and gas safely in pipelines versus trucks and trains. And you also have it making it very, very difficult to drill additional wells. They're basically halting all new permits on public lands. And it's economics 101. If you reduce supply when demand is coming back up, and it's going to come back up with a vengeance once this COVID-19 clears the air, which is going to be in a matter of months, you're going to have a supply-demand imbalance, and that's going to drive commodity prices much higher. And you're already seeing that in oil, which the Brent European mark of oil briefly touched above $70 a barrel, and natural gas spiked above $3 recently. It's back under $3, but it's going to go higher eventually too. And the political agenda behind this, which most people aren't paying attention to, is though the Biden administration is the primary catalyst in commodity prices going higher, which hurts consumers, hurts the little guy, the blue-collar worker, the middle class, the lower middle class, and lower class, where gas prices really matter to people like that. They're going to point the finger at the great Satan fossil fuel producers and say, it's your fault, it's your fault. We need to transition, move even faster to green energy and clean power. And they're going to use it for their own purposes. And that's bad for the average American. A more transitional 15, 20, 30, 40-year transition to more cleaner forms of power, which makes sense for everybody over time, is much more rational and reasonable. But once again, everything is about politics. And you're going to see the politics drive a renewed push to transition faster. And this is going to raise prices and costs for everybody, and it's going to slow down the economy. So that's going to be really interesting to watch play out. And I would add to that it's been fascinating to me to see, with all this encouragement of buying electric vehicles, that electric vehicle sales outside of Tesla are still pretty anemic. They cost more, they can't go as far, and the average consumer is saying, why would I pay a whole lot more money for something I've got to recharge every 200 miles? So the transition may move a lot slower than woke left green power advocate politicians would have you believe or would hope for. And finally, I want to give a full-throated support to capitalism. You read a lot these days about how young people in society are very favorable towards socialism. And when they think of socialism, they think of the Nordic countries. They don't think of North Korea and China and Russia and Venezuela and Argentina and Cuba and places like this. But I noticed the other day that Argentina is going to initiate a wealth tax where they're going to tax citizens with above a certain amount of wealth to try to offset their budget deficits. Argentina has defaulted on its debt multiple times in the last few decades, and they're broke again. And it's because their economy is is broken, and the Peronists, who've held power a vast majority of the time in Argentina the last 20, 30 years, just keep trying to tax, spend, default. And the quality of life for their average citizen just keeps going down. And a wealth tax in itself is very, very complicated, because how do you assess that wealth? Is that raw piece of land you hold in the country worth $50 an acre or $5,000 an acre? Well, obviously there's a reasonable range, but governments are going to want it to be worth $5,000 an acre. And where do you think the owners of companies and cash and stocks and land are going to want to go if the government comes after them for their wealth as well as their income? They're going to move. So Argentina is caught in a vicious cycle. And for a country that, believe it or not, was in the top 5 most wealthy countries in the world because of its extensive natural resources and kind of hybrid society between native residents and a lot of Europeans that moved down there after World War II, it is a shadow of its former self. And it is a great representation of when you get too much of an equity-based society instead of an equal opportunity society, that it downgrades the quality of life for everybody. Not just the quote-unquote wealthy, which is defined lower and lower over the years, where if you make $100,000 a year in Argentina, you're probably crazy wealthy and they're going to tax you to death. Everybody loses. The quality of life goes down for everybody, and society degenerates. So as our country goes through a whole lot of political debates and discussions about how you allocate resources, what's the role of philanthropy, what's the role of government, what's the role of the private sector, we've got a lot of wonderful lessons around the world of what happens when you get to more equity-based things where you try to equalize everything. The quality of life goes down for everybody. So I hope we learn from this, and the younger generations will pay attention and say, sure, we should be about social justice, and sure, we should be about equality of opportunity and looking at people the same way, irrespective of gender or race or ethnicity or background or where you live or things like that, but not at the cost of prosperity for all and opportunity for all. And I think that's a severe risk in the future going forward. And finally, I want to close with something more lighthearted before we go to questions. I am a compulsive, lifelong Dallas Cowboys fan. I love the Dallas Cowboys, and my son is about to get married and turn 26. And the last time the Dallas Cowboys were in the Super Bowl, he was 6 months old. So it's been a quarter century of horrific frustration. We haven't been to even an NFC championship game, much less a Super Bowl, in 25 years. And just the other day, the Cowboys signed our quarterback, Dak Prescott, to a $164 million 4-year contract where he's going to be paid around $40 million a year. I think it's hard to argue with that. Dak Prescott is a really outstanding young man. He's got fine character. He's a great leader, and he'll do great things for the Cowboys in the next several years. But the Cowboys completely botched this negotiation. They could have signed him 2 years ago for a probably 15% lower contract and saved an awful lot of money to amp up to other positions to give the Cowboys a chance to win. We've won one playoff game in the last 25 years, and I think it'd be hard to argue that quarterback Prescott is not one of the top 10 quarterbacks in the league. It'd be hard to argue he's top 5, but now he's the number 2 played player in the entire NFL, and he and our running back, Ezekiel Elliott, both got their big money, but at the cost of what? I kind of harken back to the days when Roger Staubach, without an agent, sat down with Tex Schramm and negotiated a full fair price contract, but saved plenty of room for Drew Pearson and Harvey Martin and Too Tall Jones and a lot of other great players so that they could win championships. So I'm a very, very frustrated, irritated Dallas Cowboys fan, and I'm sure there's others of you out there who share my sentiment. And with that editorial comment, Brandon, let's open it up for questions about the Cowboys, about the economy, about investments, about policy, whatever anybody wants to talk about.
Well, thank you, George. We're going to go ahead and transition to the Q&A. Great. So if you have a question, you can press *6 on your phone. That will enter you into the queue, and our team will process your question. So go ahead and press *6 if you have a question for George. We had quite a few questions submitted in advance. Some of these have already been answered through George's initial remarks, but I'm going to go through a couple of those while folks are being added to the queue. George, the first question that we're going to ask is, will you please share your thoughts on the future of the Texas Republican Party under the direction of our new state party chairman?
Okay, so our new state party chairman, who I'm sure is a fine gentleman and a patriot, moved here from Florida less than a decade ago. So he hadn't been in Texas very long, and he is leading the party in a very, very Tea Party, libertarian, play to the base kind of way, red meat, angry, shaking his fist at any constituency that doesn't 100% agree with him and people who follow him. And maybe that'll continue to work. I have a natural antipathy towards strategies that don't create a big tent and create a variety of viewpoints. Now, I'm a Reagan conservative, to be straight, on a political aspect. So I'm a conservative, and I believe in conservative principles of government: low taxes, low regulation, pro-private sector, pro-family, pro-community, pro-public safety. But I want a variety of viewpoints in that big tent so you can win elections, because when you don't win elections, you can't govern, you can't make decisions, and you lose control of everything. And I think that it's going to be very, very hard to win general elections in the next 10 to 20 years if we're playing to a microcosm of that tent and a very, very narrow set of viewpoints. So far, it's still worked out. Anybody that the conservative Republican Party of Texas has nominated has won statewide. But if we negotiate career politicians who are playing to that small group of people and are not outstanding in their own right, how long can we continue to win elections if people get fed up with something that doesn't really represent them in a more broad-based manner? I think that politicians need to focus on the big issues, which are education, healthcare, public safety, roads and infrastructure, water safety, power reliability, things of this sort. And if we get into more divisive issues that separate people who would agree on 60 to 90% of everything else, I think it's going to be a big negative. So I don't like the tactics. I don't like the way it's being handled. And I hope that we pivot towards a more trying to reach out rather than trying to shut the door kind of philosophy.
Great. Thank you. In that same line of thought, with today being the day that the mask mandate has been lifted, one of the questions was regarding, I know we touched on this briefly, but what do you think the effects of this will be, either how it relates to the economy or a potential rise in COVID cases here in Texas?
I think there will be a very de minimis rise in COVID cases on what would have been otherwise in the face of a trend that's irreversible, which is a significant decline in COVID cases. If I was to quibble, and I really don't want to quibble because I think the governor's done a pretty good job balancing the equities on the whole process of getting us out of this situation. He lifted the mask mandate, I think, a month or two early. Having said that, Texans were desperate for freedom, and most people have exercised that freedom by remaining cautious and continuing to require masks in restaurants and office buildings and governmental buildings and everything else. So I don't think behavior's changed that much, and I don't think it's going to change the trajectory of COVID very much either. And I think this is all going to be over in a matter of months, maybe not weeks, but months. And I think the most vulnerable in our society have been mostly vaccinated and inoculated or still staying cautious right now. So I think we can expect in the latter half of 2021 a full-throated resurgence of Texas boldness, ingenuity, and economic growth and population growth. So I'm highly optimistic, and I don't think that decision is going to impact much of anything.
Okay, thanks. One other question that came through that I'm particularly interested in hearing your thoughts on. What is your opinion on the future of office buildings, given everyone working from home and remote working these days?
That is a great question. And for anybody interested in real estate and real estate investment, I would throw out there that if we do have renewed inflation, the asset classes that perform the best in inflationary periods are commodities going away, real estate number two, and stocks a distant third. So I'm cautious on office buildings. There are the doomsayers who say the world has changed forever and we'll never go back to the office, and offices will be 20-30% less occupied than they were previously, and it will impair a bunch of real estate development. And then there's the full-throated advocates of the real estate industry who say we're going to go back to normal immediately. I think the truth's in the middle. I think we will get back to the environment we had previously, but I think it's going to take 3 to 6 years, and I don't know how long that's going to take. So I think there will be weakness in the office market in the next 3 years. We will not get back to where we were pre-pandemic in that period of time, but eventually we will, because people have very short memories, and they tend to go back to their normal when they forget about the pain of the past. And I think within 3 to 6 years we'll get there. So I'd be cautious for now, and I'd be optimistic in the future.
Great. One other question, pivoting a little bit, is just the nature of charitable giving in the near future. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that when tax rates go up next year, which they will, I think the Congress and the president before the 2022 elections, where their control of Congress will be jeopardized, that the income tax rate will go up and it will make it more attractive to make charitable contributions. And I think that, again, back to capitalism, the amount of wealth that's being generated in this country is astounding. I mean, Elon Musk went from $20 billion in net worth, which is a staggering number, to $200 billion recently, a tenfold increase in a year, to briefly become the richest man in the world. Jeff Bezos and his wife control more money than that. Between the Gates Foundation and the Gates' personal assets, they control more than that. And a lot of this money is pouring into philanthropy. So I'm very, very optimistic about philanthropy in this country, and that those dollars that are going to be used to benefit the common good and the public welfare are coming from the private sector. And it's why I would make a strong argument that we need to rely on the private sector and the philanthropy that issues from that to generate the quality of life and improve on it in the years to come. That government is not the solution, which is what everybody seems to be hearkening to. Government just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The solution is in private sector, American dynamism, an increase in our economy, and the resulting philanthropic dollars that creates. So I'm highly optimistic about that going forward.
Awesome. Just as a reminder for everyone on the call, if you have a question for George, please press *6. So right now we're going to go to our first question from the queue, and it looks like it's Mitchell, and we're going to bring him on the line now. Mitchell, are you there with us?
Yes. To follow up on the question about the office market, what do you think of the prospects for the hospitality industry if the economy comes surging back in the way that you think it will?
Well, that's a great question about a sub-asset class that's been decimated by COVID. And thanks for the question. I would say that I think that leisure hospitality, whether it's beachfront resorts or ski chalets and hotels or exotic locations that people want to go to, are going to really prosper. I think they're going to come back with a vengeance, because I think people are really pent up and really want to travel and get out and see the world. And once someone's been vaccinated twice, it's like they've gotten a new lease on life and their freedom back, and they can go do all the things that they want to do, both domestically and globally, before travel becomes too much of an imposition to continue to do so. So I'm very optimistic about that area. In terms of business travel to New York, travel to Boston, travel to San Francisco, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I'm less optimistic in the short term. I think that Zoom and some of these other remote communication devices, while not anywhere near face-to-face meetings in terms of quality and depth, can act as a very able substitute for that. So I think that hospitality in our big cities from a business travel standpoint are going to continue to suffer. They're going to come back some, but I think they will not get anywhere near they were in January of last year. So I think that's going to be a long, slow, drawn-out process. Thank you for the question. Brandon, let's go to the next one.
Great. Thanks for that. Our next question is coming from Robert. We're going to go ahead and have him join the call. Robert, are you with us?
I am. Hey, George. Bobby Mays here.
Hey, Bobby.
George, years ago, I received some correspondence from you regarding Texans for term limits that you were heading up or a part of. Where does that stand now? Are you still involved in that effort?
Well, thanks for the question, and I really wish we had more time today, and I'd have you sing a Willie Nelson song for everybody on the call, which would be the highlight of the call today. Robert Mays is the greatest facsimile of Willie Nelson on God's green earth, and if you don't know Bobby, hopefully someday you'll get to hear him sing Willie Nelson. I would answer that and say my number one issue from a policy standpoint is term limits. I think that eventually if someone stays in political life too long, they're inevitably, maybe not overtly corrupted, but implicitly corrupted by all the perks of office and all the sycophants who play up to them, and the human nature to drift towards self and ego that is fed like a ravenous beast by the political system and all the people who are feeding at the trough of political goodies and favors and everything else. So I could not be more for term limits. That campaign you mentioned, which I spent a lot of time and money and effort on, got down to we sailed through the Senate, we sailed through committee in the Texas House, and we were at a final vote in the House to go to a referendum, because that's something that has to change the Constitution and be voted on by the people of Texas where it belongs. 80% plus of Texans are for term limits. 90% plus want the right to vote on it. It was killed in the House. Governor Perry at the time took offense at it because he'd been in public office for about 30 years at that point, and he didn't like it. And there was a group called Empower Texans that really liked the fact that they had a big say in the Texas legislature with House members that had been there for a long, long time, and they adamantly opposed it, even though to me it's a core conservative principle back to the founding fathers of our country that you go serve your country or your state or your city for a short amount of time and try to improve the condition of your fellow citizens, and then you go home and be held accountable for your actions. So we lost in the House, but it's the closest term limits has ever gotten to being passed. I don't think term limits is ever going to take place in my lifetime at the federal governmental level because of the swamp and the people who cling to power so desperately up there. I think we have a real chance in Texas because we're a conservative state and we adhere to conservative principles, and this is a wildly popular policy issue. I will say, though, that I think it's going to take the governor someday championing it, and also with cooperation from the lieutenant governor and the speaker. I think it's got to come from the leadership. And I'm not optimistic right now that the leadership is going to back that, because the governor and the lieutenant governor have been in politics for decades, and I think it goes against their personal interests. So I think maybe someday, but I don't think in the near future. So thanks for bringing it up, and I couldn't be more for it. We need it desperately. Brandon, let's go to the next one.
Awesome. We've got a few more questions, but if you haven't had a chance to add yourself to the queue, just a reminder, you can press *6 on your phone if you have a question for George. Right now, we're going to go over to Susie and add her to the line so she can ask her question. Susie, are you with us? Susie, are you able to hear us? All right, we'll go to the next one, which is David Shaw. David, are you able to hear us?
Yes, thank you. So I love your optimism, but I can't see a foundation in this political environment where existing bills have no debate, no discussion. They're massive and are flying through the House and being thrown over to the Senate. And then with our children in this environment of cancel culture, I really struggle with the comments that we can work all this out through compromise in this environment. And I'd like you to kind of walk me off the cliff.
Well, that's a good question, and I appreciate you raising it. I wouldn't say that I'm optimistic on compromise and reasonability and rationality and a lack of political agenda and bias. I think you're exactly right about that, and I think that there's two armed camps in the country, one more traditional and angry and scared about where we're going, and another that's wildly angry and focused on division and splitting off into factions, which the founding fathers warned against. So politically, I'm not optimistic in the near term. But I would say that my optimism is more on the private side of things and not the public or political side of things. I think the private sector is the strength of our country, and everybody voted against us after the Great Recession and said we weren't going to come back. And despite overregulation, overtaxation, wildest spending, we came out of that Great Recession with flying colors, which was turbocharged during the last administration due to the dynamism of the private sector. And I don't want to bet against the American people, especially the people of Texas and the private sector. And as long as we don't gut capitalism and we don't gut freedom and we let the private sector work its magic, I'm optimistic. But you raise a very valid fear that is the public sector, the government, and redistribution of wealth based on favored classes and unfavored classes may trip us up. So we're just going to have to watch that in the future. But I'll remain optimistic for now, despite some of the headwinds we see. Brandon, let's take one more question.
Perfect. We're going to end with a question from Randy Lieberman. We're going to have Randy join us on the line. Can you hear us, Randy?
Yes, I can. So, given your experience and involvement with Israel, could you share your perspective on what you think is going to happen with the direction of the policy vis-a-vis Israel and the Middle East in general with the new administration?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would be a full-throated critic on many things the Trump administration did that I disagree with or don't feel good about, but that's not one of them. Getting our embassy in Jerusalem and being a recognizing that Israel has graduated from a very vulnerable, small, unwealthy country that was at risk all the time into what it is today, which is the greatest military power in the Middle East, a nuclear power with per capita GDP of around $45,000 a person right now. They are one of our top 5, maybe top 3 allies in the world. And what the Trump administration did in getting the UAE, Bahrain, and several other countries to formally recognize Israel was historical and generational and transformative. And you now have all this economic activity going back and forth between the UAE and Israel. And it's just something very exciting. And it's the greatest development for peace and prosperity in the Middle East in our lifetimes. And I am disturbed, though, that one of the first things the Biden administration started to do was pursue the Iran nuclear deal again, even though they were rudely rebuffed immediately, and also to postpone weapons sales to Saudi Arabia based on some deplorable but small instances of violence and bad behavior. What do you expect from an autocratic monarchy? I mean, they're not going to behave well all the time. And basically shunning Netanyahu for weeks and weeks and weeks at the start of the administration and having no communication until well into it. So this is kind of something that people, I think, rightly criticized President Trump about, where he was acerbic and difficult with France and Germany and Britain and some of our key allies, which was unnecessary and I don't think productive. Well, Biden's doing the same thing right now with Israel and with Saudi Arabia and some of our core allies in the Middle East. And I don't think it's going to derail the progress that was made because it's so large and so historic. But I think it's something to watch closely because that train needs to keep running. We need Saudi Arabia and some of the other countries in the Middle East to recognize Israel, and we need more stability from that because you basically have one terrible actor that can cause trouble in the Middle East at this point, and that's Iran. And there needs to be a unified front over there in facing off to Iran. And it's not going to be helpful if the Biden administration spends all its time and energy trying to cozy up to Iran and shun our allies over there. And I'm hopeful that they will not to be lied about this, but that they'll get religion pretty quick about making sure that our alliances with Israel and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Egypt and our key allies over there, the UAE, are reinforced and buttressed and not denigrated as we move forward. So thanks for a good question. Brandon, I think we'll wind it up with there. And with the world, a lot of our listeners like the fact I played some music last time around. I played some 70s music to harken back to inflationary periods of time. And with the Texas cold and the wildfires we're hearing about may start up in West Texas, and with the pandemic and with all the political Sturm und Drang, it feels sometimes like the world's on fire a little bit. So I thought I'd close our call today after you make some brief closing comments with Kerosene by Miranda Lambert, which I thought fit the thematic that well.
Great, thanks. We will send around a George Seay email newsletter. So if you've signed up for this call, you have automatically been added to our newsletter list. We send one out just about every other month. That will have the recording of this call if you'd like to share it with others. Please find us on Facebook at George Seay TX, and then also a reminder to download the See the Future podcast, and we will send out an invite for our next briefing call, which we should have in a couple of months. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thanks for being on the call today.